All right, everybody. I thank everybody for joining us. We got a guest on here today. His name is Martin. He represents a group. I believe it's called B Men, stands for Black Men. Give everybody a little bit of a background about it, kind of, what you want to talk about, where your head's at.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. So I am the executive director of B Men Foundation. We are a organization that does support groups and advocacy for Black men. We've been around since 2018. We do a support space every second Sunday for Black men from 5 to 7, and we do advocacy for issues that are specific to Black men. So that's the big idea around what I do. I've been doing that for a while, but I also been doing work with men, around men for longer than that. I have a background that spans a few different things. There's a time where I was a counselor, not anymore, but that has really informed a lot of my work with men, how I think about men and what's important. So what I've been doing lately is trying to have really conversations about men's issues, maybe the reasons why men might need support spaces, how men feel in this moment, and just make it something that people can find accessible.
Yeah, like we had talked, that's a big thing. Men feeling supported, I think, is very underrated, and I think that when it's talked about publicly, a lot of the times that it's criticized. Even in this world where a lot of people claim to be like, hey, let's be open, let's talk about things. They say that, but when it comes time to talk about men, there's still that factor, like, ooh.
Yeah. There's a quote that a friend of mine told me maybe a year ago now. I'm gonna have to attribute it to him online. But he said that our masculinity has expectations. And I've been saying that over and over again. It rings in my mind because people want you to represent a particular vision of maleness, while men are having to navigate, and we have to change, we have to evolve and be softer and be more emotionally responsive. But what happens when we do that? Like, if everybody else hasn't changed their perception of us, and we are adjusting to meet these things in a world that still, in some senses, want a very traditional man that doesn't complain and accepts hardship and just keeps on trucking, then we're gonna have a hard time. So I feel like we're in that space now where we're negotiating. How much of the masculinity do you want? What can I keep? And all of that.
Yeah, and that's it's a big thing. So I think even a lot of men that want that burden per se, right, of the traditional role. I
Uh-huh.
don't think a lot of them even want like a red carpet treatment. I'm sure there's some egotistical, crazy guys out there. There's always those guys that it's easy to be like, oh, hey, that's the example, right? But I
Uh-huh.
think most men that would prefer the traditional role, right? I don't think a lot of them want like a red carpet tip or tape parade. No, they just want to be like, hey, I'm important to this house, just like mom is.
Yeah. Yeah.
You
Just to
know,
be valued in a real way.
yeah, and I think now, like, a lot of people be like, men should talk about their feelings, right? Like June technically still is men's mental health month. But out of every month, anything that's dedicated to any kind of, purpose or whatever, men's mental health month, you like barely hear about it. It's like an afterthought. You hear more about Turkey Day, you hear more about President's Day or
Uh-huh.
some random holiday than you do men's mental health month. It just gets
Uh-huh.
completely blown to the side.
Uh-huh.
And I think that that's what contributes to a lot of the problems and why men feel like so isolated. Like you're saying, they'll say, hey, express your feelings, you, like talk to your spouse. And I know a lot of guys that I grew up with, and I won't put them out there. Their wives, they feel like, hey, if I go tell my wife this, she's going to look at me. Like, what's wrong with you? Why are you even thinking that way? Just they get that kind of response from them, or at least they feel they will. But you
Uh-huh.
also ask them to be like, no, my wife loves me. She does treat me right and all that, but I don't feel like I can talk to her about my problems as a man
Yeah.
because they'll feel like they all of a sudden they feel like even though there's supposed to be this progressive mentality out there per se for how we're supposed to be able to talk about it,
Uh-huh.
but that even when push comes down to shove, where like when you get to the brass tacks of it,
Uh-huh.
it's still just like no, it's minimized. No, we don't care as much. We only care if you're losing your ever living mind and flipping out. That's when it becomes important.
Yeah. And I actually wrote two things about this. I wrote for the Good Man Project. If there's anybody watching who hasn't been affiliated with the Good Man Project or hasn't been in touch with them or seen anything that they've put out, please check it out. Two pieces that I wrote. One of them is When Men Cry in Public, and the sort of thing that happens when men, when we break the masculine expectation and we cry and we let the tears out, and somebody has a camera and it becomes a viral moment to talk about men crying. And I'm like, and then the other thing that I wrote was about how men's mental health becomes a joke, specifically related to the point that you just brought up, that this month is Men's Mental Health Awareness Month. Last month was Mental Health Awareness Month. And every year I'll be active on Twitter or online, the socials, and there's always somebody making a joke out of men's mental health for giggles, and it'll go viral. And I'm like, man, this is every year. This is like maybe the third year I've seen it. So I said, let me write about it, because men are getting caught in those what can feel like traps where you're asked to adapt or adjust in some way. And when you do, you're not met with the thing that you need.
Yeah, and that's, there's a lot of women out there that I think do truly care. They do truly, like I've said, my wife is one of them. She thinks a little bit traditional to a point, but she's also, I feel, she does care about how I feel.
Right,
And it is important to her. And I'm a very lucky man in that aspect.
right,
I've seen a lot of relationships where that's not the case. Like one of my good friends, like I said, he loves his wife, they have kids, but I don't think he feels comfortable going to his wife for certain things.
mm,
And just because of how he feels he's going to be looked at.
yeah,
And, that's just, I don't, it's just, to me, it's a tragedy it's that way.
uh-huh,
I think a lot of modern feminists are very respectful of men's mental health.
uh-huh,
Obviously, I don't think they're going to put his priority on it like you or I would.
uh-huh.
But I also don't feel like certain part of the feminist community like could care. It's just like they could care less.
Yeah, it's we've in a society now where we're thinking and making room for women to contribute their experience and their philosophies to how we understand the man's world, which is what has been framed as for so long. And there's a couple of different strands that come out of feminist philosophy. And one of them is that men have a mode of masculinity that is curated towards oppressing or dominating the lesser folks. That's an idea that they have. When and then the other one is that resources should be devoted and given towards women, which is that's a part of their advocacy. So I'm not mad at them for that. The rub comes when there's a desire for men to be better and to respond better and to not be violent and do all these things that will make the world a better place to live in. And it's time to change our expectations and understandings and denote resources to these men, the alienated manosphere men. And then it's that now it's like, no, we shouldn't be doing that to them. We shouldn't be giving them those resources. So when you get caught in these modes of, and you can find the inverse in the manosphere too, where you start dehumanizing people who have another view. Now, when the problems arise, you don't see them as worthy enough to get support. That's the thing that annoys me.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's unspoken, but it's
yeah,
there.
it's there.
It's unspoken, but it's just as much there and as clear as the camera in front of our faces.
Yeah, yeah,
But everybody, it's like the big elephant in the room that and nobody wants to talk about, men nor women. And then
yeah. No,
when it's brought up, it's
yeah.
automatically villainized.
And it shouldn't be, because this is why I changed my approach to supporting men, because I used to be the corrective position of men support, like men need to do better and this XYZ. And for men, specifically black men are always given some sort of accountability narrative since we've been on this side of the ocean, and that there's something we're doing wrong, somebody needs to punish us or correct us. And when I would go and talk to guys in that way, it just was so disconnected from the way that they think of themselves and their communities and the things that they're already doing. And I was like, all right, what are some affirming models of masculinity where we look at masculinity not as something that's harmful and dominating, even though we know that can happen, where men see masculinity as service and support and respect and reverence and responsibility. Like, what happens when we turn that up?
Right.
Like, you know,
Yeah,
then that's what happens. That's the question I've been trying to get people to think about.
yeah. And it's, like when I think of masculinity and kind of like masculinity, I should say, and thinking about like what you're saying is, so like I had told you, I've got a friend who she's a therapist, she's got a degree in psychology and things of that nature. And, she talks about like, how some of these feminists that, and she's a feminist herself, I've known her for a long time. She's very pro woman. She's very, like she's very big in all those kinds of things. And she has a husband. And, something that she was telling me about is it took a long time for her to get her husband to be comfortable. I don't say like not treating her as an equal, right? Because that's not what she's saying. Like to be like, hey, being open with her, that maybe where he might not have been. And to make sure that he understood that he wasn't going to be judged because of it, and that it doesn't fit the narrative of feminism, right? Well,
Uh-huh.
certain feminists, let me be clear.
Uh-huh.
It just doesn't fit that narrative. And I think that's like what is kind of like what the starting point is. And then
Uh-huh.
it just like explodes from there. Yeah.
Yeah.
Even if there's a lot of women out there who do say, oh, hey, we want our man to have feelings, right?
Uh-huh.
As long as he has a job and he's paying the bills,
Mm.
let him
Yeah.
lose that job and, oh, you've got feelings. That's nice. Go get another job.
Yeah. Suddenly those masculine expectations she wanted him to be free of are the ones she's calling back into the space.
Yeah. And that is still there to this day. That is still the vast majority,
Uh-huh.
in a lot of situations where, there's a couple together. And to me, it's very, very hard to and how do you get both sides to realize that, everybody, like there's things that like women are way better at multitasking than men.
Uh-huh.
That's just, a woman with 3 kids in a house trying to, rally the house to get, dinner together. They're going to do a way better job than I would.
Uh-huh.
Because when it's me, I'm like straight to the point. Hey guys, this is what we got to do. Da da da. All right, boom, boom, boom.
Uh-huh.
Where my wife, the chaos can be going around with the kids, but there's just certain things that women are better at than men, and that's
Uh-huh.
okay.
Yeah.
And I think that that's something that people who I would say don't understand masculinity don't
Uh-huh.
truly understand that a lot of men are like, yeah, man, there's a lot of things that my wife is better at than me, and it
Yeah.
doesn't bother them.
And it doesn't. I think that masculinity has ways that is virtuous and protective towards women that's oftentimes silent and unspoken because that's part of the man thing is that you don't talk about. Not only do you not talk about the hard things, you don't talk about the good things either. Sometimes you're
Right.
just like I'm cool, I'm good. I don't need it. I can do without it. And sometimes we can have this thing where we forget that our partners, if you're dating women, didn't come from that sort of socialization. So they need that warmth. It responds to them in a different way. Because for us, it can be costly to be vulnerable,
Yeah.
but not in the same way for them.
Yeah, like, have you ever seen some of those videos they got out there? These young ladies, they go, my husband works hard. I really appreciate him. When he comes home, hey, I try to, and these are younger, young women. I don't even know if they have a family going yet, but they're just married. Hey, I made sure, he worked hard all day. He worked 6 days straight, 15 hours, that type of thing. And back, I made sure, hey, I cooked him a meal. This, that, and the other thing. And then I'll click on it and I read the comments, and these young ladies are just being vilified by other women. And I'm like, she's not treating him as her boss. She's just going, hey, my partner just killed himself this week, essentially, working like
Mhm.
crazy, went through all this. I'm trying to help him out.
Yeah,
And I don't see the harm in that.
yeah, I mean, this is something that's like fundamental to our culture that we get caught on. We struggle with because we American Western ideas and philosophies like really lean into duality, like good and bad, like dominant, submissive, masculine, feminine. Like we kind of
Yeah.
lean into that very quickly. And when you have, especially social media, like everything is rage bait. So if a woman is showing up responsive and caring to her partner, then she's being dominated, she's being subjugated, she's being oppressed. So it's hard to find balance when maybe somebody, let's say for some people, they wouldn't have had that approach with their partner. That's okay, but we can celebrate somebody who's found a good dynamic with the person they're with, even if it's not the type that you would have or want.
Yeah. And that respect factor just in general isn't there.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think like the big challenge where I think like, based on, the stuff that, we've talked about and I've seen is that's kind of like what I think that you do is important, and to me, like that way of thinking is what's more needed. We need more of that. And I feel like women should want more of that just in general, because a man who's more willing to accept himself as a man, not feel that he's bad because he's a man or that he's demonizing or being sexist just because he's a man, that he
Uh-huh.
understands the things going on, right? Understands his role as a man, can kind of, I don't say like embrace the duality,
Uh-huh.
but understand what it is, right? And try to play that balancing act to a degree.
Yeah.
I feel like that's where a man's role kind of is in this modern era, right? And how do you find a
Mhm.
partner that can respect that and can kind of meet you halfway,
Yeah.
and that's hard, because that's a whole bowl soup of words and thoughts, to when that, a lot of times on the other end, it's like I was just saying, well, you don't have a job, go get one.
Yeah.
I know you're upset. I know you want to cry. You want to just be mad at the world, but that's nice. Jimmy needs some new pants next week, so go get a job.
Yeah. I think that halfway is, as a society, we're determining what halfway means because
It's
we don't
difficult.
know. It's difficult because if you are coming from we're becoming increasingly secular. Most people still go to some sort of church or religious service within a month period of time. But people are moving away with each generation. And with that becomes the norms and expectations of what the culture is supposed to be, particularly if you're not if you're not in a very culturally ethnic background that prescribes those. So what I'm saying is, if you don't have those models for this is how I'm supposed to do it. My mom and dad did it just like this, and I'm gonna do it like that. And now you can get on the internet and see 10 different ways every day for the next 10 years. You don't quite know what normal is. And how do I know if I'm being taken advantage of? How do I know if I'm giving enough? And now you have chat GTPs. Now people don't even they might ask the internet or AI, what should I do? And AI is gonna always be agreeable. So
Yeah, they'll tell you what you
that's
want to hear.
yeah, it's there's a lot competing for people's attention and how they should ground their emotions and expectations.
Yeah, and those things create the big trust issues where men and women don't know what they can trust, and then that fuels those bubbling feelings even more. And then it just bubbles over, then it bubbles over, and then next thing you know, like when you see like a lot of like protests or people rallying at events, where rather than everybody just going, hey, you do your thing, I do mine, everybody's just, it's that toxic, like, boom, I want to be in your face, I hate you because you're not me. Boom,
Because you're
boom, boom,
not
boom.
me. That's such a great way to frame that because we are becoming increasingly threatened with difference.
Yes.
We don't people are, and I think there's opportunities within everyday life where folks can touch another person or be engaged. But if you're only looking at digital things as a reference point, you forget that you just seen that person at the store the other day, or you go to church with them, or you might see them at a stop. Like that person that is like a real person with their own motivations who also wants to live a good life.
Right. And we all do.
Right.
It's something that when I teach like managers and things like that, when I hold meetings, like a big thing that I try to tell everybody when you're looking for candidates that you want to move up into management or hire from the outside, you never look at somebody for what they are.
Uh-huh.
Look at where you think they can be
Uh-huh.
and don't expect yourself out of them.
Right.
If you follow those two principles, you're setting that person up for success. So to me, if a man and a woman can approach that same way,
Yeah.
they're setting each other up for success. They're going, I realize that I'm not you, you're not
Uh-huh.
me.
Yeah.
How can I build you up to be the best wife that you can be,
Uh-huh.
or mother? How can I support you, and vice versa?
Uh-huh.
And that's always been one of my guiding principles in management
Yeah.
is don't make somebody to be myself. Why? Because that makes you micromanage.
Yeah.
And then everything that person does is just going to be wrong to begin with because,
Uh-huh.
you're not, you should do it this way. Oh my God, I want it this way, and
Uh-huh.
respecting differences,
Right.
and realizing somebody is different. A person who had worked for me, well, 10, 12 years ago, she was big feminist. I mean, big time.
Uh-huh.
She, to this day, she still goes to all those rallies and stuff. And she
Uh-huh.
worked for me for a while, right? And, like politically we're different, but, like she really liked working. And I said, and I was like, what? I was like, what made you work for me? Because when I had moved on to a different thing, she quit.
Oh,
And,
okay.
and she was like, well, I liked working for you. I was like, well, what was the difference? She was like, because you let me be me.
Uh-huh.
You gave me a framework of how you wanted the job done,
Uh-huh.
and you let me get the job done
Yeah.
and respected my individuality.
Yeah.
And I think that sometimes a lot of super hardcore feminists, like
Mm.
the ones that are, like both sides have their, I think to me, a toxic male person, if you wanted to, what's that gentleman's name that was in jail over in, I think it was Austria.
You talking about Andrew Tate?
Yes.
Yeah.
Like I get the premise behind a lot of what he says, but a lot of his verbiage is meant to incite. Yeah, I get like the principle that he's going after,
Hmm.
you know what I mean? But it's like, hey man, yeah, well, in parts of the world and even parts of America, that kind of does still apply. Not the real world that any of us live in anymore.
And what he's trying to do, I'm glad you brought that up because one of the things that appeal to people across the manosphere. So manosphere, just for folks who may not know, is a group of communities that rally around kind of increasingly hostile views of women and domination to frame their masculinity. But what they do that pulls people into it, men are hurting and they offer an answer.
Yeah.
And men will go there and pay for a some sort of membership and have somebody tell them that the answer is to be an alpha male and to dominate other people and to make women do things like that's the answer that's given to them. And I think that us as people, in whatever way that we do it, I do it through be men, other people do it through other ways. You might do it through how you manage people. You give people you allow them to be seen in their pain, but you give them a response to it that's healthy.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that's key.
Yeah.
That is key, you know, and Andrew Tate is just, I wish that the world would not give him a platform, you know, because to me, there will never be the progress that we want for men to be like, hey, you can, like the traditional role that Tate advocates is still there.
Hmm.
But the way he's advocating it is the very thing that the hardcore feminists are fighting against.
Yeah,
And all he's doing is giving them fuel for the fire.
and we need somebody like that. We need the hardcore feminists to tell us where the lines are. You know, and you need somebody to
Yeah.
say, too much going, because sometimes they can see things before they happen, and they might be navigating the stories of those men that are showing up in that way and how they're being harmful and abusive to women. So here's an example. In terms of the younger generation, there's a significant amount of them that is gaining information from these manosphere sites and communities. And the reason I say that is that when we don't offer an alternative, that's where they're going to go.
And it's hard. Like you're a very like you seem to be a very like I would say like balanced person, like right, like want to do the right thing, like we want to find a solution.
Right.
But it's like that voice almost gets minimized, like, oh hey, we know that's the right way,
Yeah.
but that's not what's gonna sell.
They want the salacious response, and then
Yeah.
you get people from the most polarized positions. Because in the reality, this I actually learned this from doing community organizing. You're trying to get if you want people to really make a movement. Let's say if you have a bell curve where most of the people occupy the middle, it's the extremes that you want to get people to feel strong enough to move a little bit.
Yeah.
Like most people in the middle don't care; they're indifferent. You know,
Yeah. I mean, just want to live your life.
they just want to live their life, and you want to get people to be just a little bit more engaged. So that's what I want. I want to get people to be a little bit more thoughtful about solutions, which a solution oriented thing is a very man thing. Like I want to. We could talk about it all day. How do you solve the problem? You know, that's what I want to do.
Yeah. It's about like getting people to realize we can come to the table and not be jerks.
Yeah.
You know, like not per se, quote unquote, get political, but Ronald Reagan, you know,
Uh-huh.
his arch nemesis per se in government when he was president was a man named Tip O'Neill. He was
Uh-huh.
Speaker of the House.
Uh-huh.
I believe it was every Friday or whatever day of the week it was. Every week at a certain time they had dinner together.
Uh-huh.
Not as men of the government, but
Uh-huh.
as two men that were friends. But now in the political theater, complete polar opposites, you know, but because they understood who each other were as men and as individuals,
Uh-huh.
they were able to come together and get some things done, even though they didn't necessarily agree. And I
Uh-huh.
feel like that kind of mentality should apply to the masculinity atmosphere as well. Because to me, that like that approach, that way of thinking
Yeah.
is what men need, you know, and
Uh-huh.
the problem is that kind of approach is minimized in the Andrew Tates of the world are
They pick up.
popularized. And
Exactly.
have you ever heard of a man named Jordan Peterson?
I have.
Yeah, he's kind of in that camp to a degree,
Uh-huh.
but he's a little bit more towards the center of it, you know.
Uh-huh.
At least to me, he is. You know, I mean, there's some things that he says where I'm kind of like, nah. But I feel like he does to a point recognize like, hey, it is a different way. And I feel like he tries to get some men to go like, hey, you know, yes, you still are the provider. And I feel like he speaks on how a lot of men feel like, hey, you know, yeah, I do matter, but again, Johnny needs a pair of pants, get a job. You know, and he says, hey, that is the reality. But he also says what you do feel does matter.
Yeah. I mean, so one thing that reminds me of is that a lot of times when I'm talking to people about working with men and just engaging men in a serious way or a real way, is that regardless of what you feel, is it approachable? I think a lot about an invite. Where's the invite? Where are they gonna feel like I want to be here and talk to this person? So I when I was younger, I would have the approach of trying to talk to men and leaning on problematizing their approach to masculinity. Men need to be better and sort of feminist molded models of hegemonic masculinity. And I would go to men in that way, and it just didn't take. They just were not feeling that. And I was like, all right, I'm not doing something right. So what I did was with the men in the sort of spaces that we build, we have men come through there. We don't ask them what their political views are. We can talk politics. It'll come up with black men. We're politicized in a lot of ways. But it doesn't matter what space they come from in the political field. And so I'll start it off and say, we're the Men Foundation. We've been here for this amount of years, and we're bringing men together. If you're formerly incarcerated, straight, gay, trans, wherever you are, we're welcoming to you, because once you're in this experience as a black man, you're gonna have things that you need from us. So being able to respond to people's need instead of trying to like make them have the right thought about it, that's what turned me around in terms of how I approach it.
And the problem is the reason why I like the hey, we need to do better part, because I think that it was at one point, at least for me growing up, was something that was very relevant.
Hmm.
Growing up, coming from that old school world, go to work, come home, do everything that moms, you know what I mean? Kick your feet up, blah, blah, blah. It was, hey, we got to do better. Even my father told me, hey, you got to do better.
Yeah.
Be better than, change the world.
Hmm.
And, but I don't think that is like as much of a necessary thing, because it's not common anymore for dad to come home if he had a long day at the bar or long day at work and went to the bar, come home and, he's abusive.
Hmm.
That stuff still does happen. I'm not saying it doesn't, because it's still, I won't say necessarily common, but it's still a problem.
Hmm.
But I don't think it's the standard anymore, right? So I feel like men have gone beyond that. Not that everybody did it back then, but that was like the stereotype.
Hmm.
Dad got off work at the factory or the bank or whatever, went to the bar, had a bunch of drinks, come home. I'm sure you've seen older movies. Dad comes
Yeah.
home when he's abusive and breaks everything.
Yeah.
Well, that mentality is still stuck in
Hmm.
society, you know,
Hmm.
but I don't think it's that way anymore. Like how men
Hmm.
are. Let me rephrase it. Like it's that men aren't that way in society anymore. And there's always probably some, and I feel like again, the Andrew Tates of the world, they do
Hmm.
nothing but bring it back to the forefront. Yes, this is how men are. It's okay for men to
Hmm.
be that way.
Hmm.
No, it's not. Like first, not even because you're a man. It's not okay for anybody to be that way. Man,
No.
woman, gay, straight. Nobody should be that way towards another human.
No.
And I think that, once guys like Andrew Tate kind of fade away, which he kind of has, since his legal issues have arose, his status has definitely went down significantly. Still popular, but it's went down.
Hmm.
As more of those guys kind of fade away, I think, you'll see a little bit more balanced guys that are like, hey, yeah, I am a man, but I'm me. I care
Hmm.
about me. I care about other men, and we matter. And you're starting to see some guys like that. Like I said, like I know Jordan Peterson's still kind of in that camp, but I feel like he moves a little bit more towards the center. Denzel Washington comes to mind.
Hmm.
But a lot of the speeches he gives at universities,
Hmm.
it's talking to men and women, but it's a masculine approach
Hmm.
without demonizing anybody.
Right.
And I feel like he's probably one of the best examples out there of how to be masculine without putting women.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point. And what I try to tell people is that embedded in masculinity are already women supporting views and approaches. They're already in there. You just have to pull them out. So if the only messages that we're giving to men is that there's something wrong with you, like eventually you're going to hit a tipping point where
Yes.
men are they're going to start to reject that. So like
Yeah.
what I've done is I've talked to men about really big things. I've been brought in around accountability stuff if man has been involved in sexual assault in some way. And I started to think about, because this is one thing about a hyperpolarized society and the algorithm. If I stood up one day and said, these men need to stop raping women, men are taught to be dangerous, and if we don't deal with hegemonic masculinity, all of our sons will be rapists. If I start talking like that, I will be viral. I will move up the ranks
Yeah. Oh yeah, big time.
very quickly.
You'd be getting one of the $1 million YouTube checks, man.
But yeah, because people love that. But I just don't feel like I feel like that's limiting to the reality of who men are, and I don't feel like it works very well.
Yeah,
So,
and it's not real.
and it's not real. So, but also respecting and learning from the things that are coming from people who are feminists or people who, however they describe their advocacy, talking about consent, talking about rape culture, talking about ways to be better and how to communicate and effective models is important. What I learned with that, though, me and a couple of guys, we did a workshop a couple of years ago around men responding to sexual violence, and we sat around and men talked about their own stories, including me, of a time where we didn't show up well around some version of sexual harm, from something small to something big. Everybody had a story. But what I learned is that men don't get lessons around consent. Nobody tells us what it looks like to say yes and no. So when we get to dealing with women, we're kind of moving from the framework of how our lives have gone.
Yes.
You know what I'm saying? Does it make
Yeah.
sense?
Yeah, no, that makes it makes perfect sense. Because you don't have that, it's kind of like when you're taught to ride a bike or you're taught to how to do certain things, right? You have that kind of like that. You're taught how to balance yourself. You're taught how to adjust. And when it comes, especially to the sexual, like you're just men are kind of just left to, hey, hopefully it all works out for you, buddy. Don't do nothing stupid. I kind of feel like that's how it's treated. Like, hey, man, just don't do nothing stupid. And I really hope, the one of the biggest things that I hear when it comes to men and that is be careful who you choose. And it's like, yeah, that applies both ways. But with men, I feel like it's more definitely of a heightened thing of don't put yourself in a position to where that could become a problem. And it's like, it's a bummer that anybody would have to do that, right? But it's just men are treated that way. Like, hey, man, I kind of hope it works out. Like, oh, yeah, some parents will talk to children about sex, this, that, and the other thing. But it's really not put in a way that teaches you how as a man to go, okay, the modern woman's different than mom. And I think a lot of
Mm,
mothers don't know how to handle it, right? Because they're like,
yeah.
well, these young ladies are way different than me. So how do they teach their sons? How does dad teach his son to deal with a world that essentially says he can be terrible just because he's a man?
Right. So what happens when a man, what happens, let me give you a scenario. If a woman comes up and she say touches a man on his butt or something and he's not into that and he doesn't know how to say no, I don't like that, because we're taught violence or nothing.
Yes, yes,
So we don't even have language for our own. If you cross into our boundary, we don't even know how to tell you respectfully or disrespectfully how to, like, I didn't like that, can you not do that? So when we're met with women that we now have to learn how to hear and understand consent, we're like we're struggling both ways. We're struggling
yes.
to learn what to say, and we also don't have our own sense of self-reflection around what do I like and what do I not like.
Right. Yeah. And it's just a shame that it is that way because, men have a lot to offer to the world beyond going home and bringing home the paycheck and making sure the bills are paid. There's things like, a young man's going to interpret how to play baseball a lot differently or football or hockey from his father than he will his mother. Not saying
Right.
that the way she's teaching him can be wrong or isn't right, but it's teaching that as you grow and you learn things, different neurons fire in your brains, right? And there's just something that comes off from when dad does it or a man teaches you as a man than when mom does it, right? Because you're going to learn, like, women react differently than men,
Uh-huh.
but a man needs to understand how to react as a man, but also learning how to react in today's society it's very challenging for young men. I
Yeah.
mean, it is. I'm 40. I'm not happy that I'm 40, but I definitely do not envy the younger men and
Yeah.
what they're dealing with because they're almost they're in a lose-lose situation a lot of times. Even if they're good
Uh-huh.
young men that work hard, do the right thing, they're not problems.
Uh-huh.
They care. They take. They're with their families before they're married. I know young men like my brother-in-law, my sister's husband. They're 22, 23 years old.
Uh-huh.
They're on their second kid, but guess what? They're married. He goes to work. He comes home. He
Uh-huh.
help my sister works too. They take care of each other, right? It's like it's how it should be to a degree, right? Like
Uh-huh.
they're partners with each other,
Yeah.
and they value one another.
Uh-huh.
And like he to him, my sister walks on water.
Uh-huh.
And to my sister, he walks on water.
Uh-huh.
Even with the stress of they've got a 1 year old and another baby on the way,
Uh-huh.
and it's still that way. And it's like that is the exception. And I know a lot of young men want that, right? They want that acceptance of their own internal family, and it's just not there.
Yeah.
And how do you, from like your perspective, how would a young man go?
Yeah, community. Isolation is one of the biggest risk factors for mental health that I talk about. Because once you get isolated, not you have no frame of reference for how you're showing up, your own care, your own responsiveness, not checking in with your mental health providers or general health providers. Like, because we'll do that, we'll have a hard time and we'll go off somewhere and try to meditate and figure it out and
Yeah,
become more hardened. But finding community and finding other men who can relate to the problems and things that you're going through is an important thing. That's why I created that support space. But
yeah,
even when I can't have it, places like I like physical activity. I like want to play basketball. Just a place where there's some camaraderie. You can be seen by other people, experienced by other people. For some men, it's video games and video game lobbies that they have friends. They just game together and they small talk in the waiting areas.
yeah,
Sometimes it's church, sometimes it's other fraternal organizations. But I think that young men, when you're dealing with the things that come with development, seeking out community is it doesn't feel like a big intervention. But once you get in a space and somebody tells you, "Oh, I've been there. This is what I did. This was like for me," or I understand, like it just changes the
yeah.
way you feel about it.
You get a basis to how you can understand your own feelings.
Yes. Yes.
You like you're never going to feel the exact way the other person does, but you get an idea of like, oh, okay, and that's why I kind of named the podcast member, right? Because you got to understand how other people think, how they feel in order to understand the situation. Not everything's cut and dry. It would be nice if like worked that way.
Right.
As much as we all think that it never did 100 years ago.
Right.
Things weren't cut and dry. It was just the news was cut and dry.
Mm-hmm.
So you didn't see it flashed on TV every 30 seconds.
Mm-hmm.
The news just kind of reported certain things and everything else was left behind closed doors.
Right.
It's unfortunate. Before we wrap it up here, give people, your website to say, hey, and everything where they can go.
Yeah, you can check out my organization at bmanfoundation.org. You can check out my writing at Till We Free on Medium and Martin H. Speaks on Substack. And, I publish periodically here and there. Martin H. Speaks is my website, martinhspeaks.com. Yeah, I'm out here. I'm around. So hopefully people can find my work and what I'm doing.
Yeah, I've got some other people like if I can get my friend, if I can ever get her to peel away from her desk, I would love to have her on and you on like because it's just like I feel like man, that's just like that could really go like some really in-depth conversation on it.
Yeah.
That would just, it's been a great episode. I loved it. I love talking about things that are just not the standard of every time you click on the internet.
Right. Right.
Because to me that's how you enact change. That's how you get people to start thinking.
Mm-hmm.
Be the one thing when people are scrolling through the shorts that they notice
Yeah.
instead of that quick 5 second, oh, haha, phone gets put down, they walk to the kitchen.
Right.
And I feel like these are the type of things that as society changes,
Mm-hmm.
men like you, hopefully podcasters like me, just in general, right? Like that those conversations become more normal and people are
Mm-hmm.
willing to talk about it. And, like I said, what you do is something that a lot of men would find intimidating. I can tell you right now, I would find very intimidating to sit in a room with a bunch of men and go, so how do you feel? Like not necessarily like that's what you say, right? But I wouldn't know how to respond because that's my wife had to teach me how to respond to her. Like not like teach me how, but like how to go, okay, hey, it's okay to talk about this with you. We're first 5 years, it was I would be like, hey, leave me alone, just don't bother me. Let me process this, let me sleep on it for an hour or two, and I'll be fine.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not healthy for a man.
Mm-hmm.
Not healthy for anybody but especially a man because a man's got to have that outlet, right? And I think like what you do helps men get to that point to where they can, and that's just it's not an easy thing to do. And then unfortunately, you get the Andrew of the world that poison it.
Right.
Like I said, I will die on that rock. That man has poisoned the society.
Yeah.
He is a cobra. So, but I don't want to beat up on the guy too much. He's still a human. But
Sure.
again, Martin, it was great having you on. Hopefully we can have you on again here soon. And, I'm still in touch with my friend, every so often. We can get another one together. We can do like another one on masculinity. A feminist psychologist kind of in there too, but she's not
Mm-hmm.
so far on that way.
Yeah,
She's a great person, just a great human being. So, I look forward to that.
for sure. Yeah, thanks for having me on.
All right, thanks. Have a good one, Martin.
All right, you too.